Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us this evening. My name is Rebecca Ewald, and I have the honor of being your village manager for Shorewood for about the last 3.5 years. In early 2020, the village board approved an educational seminar on the process and other considerations of historical designations. And those plans were postponed to deal with COVID and the pandemic. Our planning and efforts tonight are a part of that endeavor from the village board, collaboratively with the Sherwood Historical Society, the library, and the Wisconsin State Historical Society, as we're all co-sponsoring this 3-part series to learn more about Shorewood's history, to learn more about Shorewood's architecture, and tonight, which is the last session of our series, to learn about different options that communities have in order to preserve their history. So one of the things that I found in talking about history here in the village is that many times there's misunderstandings or at times incorrect information. I know that the first 2 sessions for us have been really valuable in establishing a good educational base on Shorewood. And Jason Tish joins us tonight from the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And he's going to help us look at those preservation tools. Jason's worked with historic preservation policies at the national, state, and local levels since 1996. He's worked in the public and private sectors as a historic preservation specialist, architecture historian, and consultant, and has deep experience developing and applying historic preservation policies. He has degrees in geography, anthropology, and planning and landscape architecture. He currently serves as a certified local government and preservation education coordinator at the Wisconsin State Historic Preservation Office, where his job is to recognize the unique objectives in each community and help people in those communities use the tools of preservation to meet their objectives. I would be remiss if I did not also introduce the lovely other faces on our call tonight, 2 of which are from the Shorewood Historical Society. We have Karen DeHartdog, who is here with us and was also one of our key lecturers in series 1 and available for questions in session 1, and then questions in session 2. And along with her, she has Kathy Keene, who I have had the pleasure of getting to know this year, also with the Shorewood Historical Society. So thank you both for being a part of this team effort. It has made all of the difference. So before we turn it over to Jason, just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items for tonight. I'm going to be serving as facilitator for purposes of series and question responses following. But we also have the wonderful assistance from the State Historical Society in the form of Amy Wyatt. So she is going to be off screen coordinating technical things, moderating the questions as they come in and bringing them to our attention. And then last but not least, wanted to cover a couple of ground rules. First, attendees will be muted upon their entry into the programming tonight. Questions for presenters, if you do have them, please type them into the Q&A box. We're going to have some polling questions right before we turn it over to Jason that we will do. And if there are any technical problems, please use the chat box to communicate those to Amy so she has an opportunity to troubleshoot with you. So to get us started this evening, we're going to ask you 2 polling questions. How did you learn about this series? If you could take the opportunity and click one of those for us, we would greatly appreciate it, because we're going to continue this dialogue within the community. So learning how you obtained information about us will help us do our job better in re-communicating with you on different opportunities in the future. How are we looking, Amy?
We have almost everybody who has voted. We'll give another second or 2 if anybody else wants to vote in the poll. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for providing that information. We're going to move on to our second polling question of the evening, and this one is also quite interesting to us. It's what brought you to this conversation. So many people who have called in or have taken the time to talk with me about this series coming up have really been motivated to attend based on very different reasons. So if you could take an opportunity to look at some of the options before you and see which one most appropriately fits what brought you here this evening, that would be very helpful to us.
So do a couple of more seconds.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks, Amy. And now we're going to turn it over to Jason.
Hey everyone, it's good to be with you this evening. It's been really fun to work with this team putting this series together. A lot of communities around Wisconsin approach this conversation about how they can conserve their historic properties, historic buildings and places in their city. And you guys are doing it the right way. You're entering into a conversation with a lot of public engagement, which is a really good way to start the conversation. So this is the third in this series. Hopefully most of you or all of you have been able to join us for the first two sessions in this series. I'll just introduce myself as I'm with the Wisconsin State Historic Preservation Office. If you see my name down in my little window, SHPO, that's the State Historic Preservation Office. And I just want to put that into, let me get my screen shared so you can see all of my information. Okay. Amy, is the screen okay there?
We do not see your screen yet.
Okay, let me try again. There we go. That's right, right?
Yes, got it.
Good. And I can see you all, and okay, here we go. So I just wanted to put the State Historic Preservation into a broader context of the Wisconsin Historical Society. This is our building in Madison on the UW-Madison campus. And the State Historic Preservation Office is kind of embedded in the State Historical Society. Other parts of the society include the State Archives that collects all the physical stuff associated with all aspects really of Wisconsin history, from folk art to sports memorabilia, military uniforms, and stuff from social and political movements. We are the American History Library for the UW-Madison and a depository library for local, state, and federal government publications. And we share all of those collections with a statewide network of area research centers. We operate the Wisconsin Historical Museum in downtown Madison on the Capitol Square, and currently planning a brand new museum on the other side of the square from the current location. We own and operate 11 historic sites around the state. We have educational services, online interactive resources and publications, research tools, lesson plans, all related to Wisconsin history. We host the Wisconsin component of National History Day each year for middle and high school students. Local history, we provide an outreach, support, and networking opportunities for local historical organizations and museums statewide. We operate the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. We publish books for adults and kids on Wisconsin history and the quarterly Wisconsin Magazine of History. We operate, the society operates with some federal funding and some state funding, but we also raise money through the Wisconsin Historical Foundation that helps meet operational costs and undertake special projects. And finally, the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO. We're a state agency, a federally designated office defined by the National Historic Preservation Act, and every state has one. And we work with communities and organizations and individuals to identify, interpret, and preserve historic places in Wisconsin. Just to recap.
Excuse me, Jason. Sorry, I just want to, I think your notes are maybe hitting your microphone.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll move them to the other side. Is that better?
Yeah, I think that should be better.
Okay. I'll move a little closer as well. So just to recap the first two sessions, in session one, Karen DeHartog presented a history of the area that we now call Shorewood, from the settlement by American Indians to the dense 20th century development as a streetcar suburb that we see now. In session two, I walked through the architecture and history surveys that had been done in Shorewood. We looked at the architecture of much of the building that happened during that streetcar suburb period of Shorewood. And so this session, I'm going to take a closer look at some of the tools that are available to municipal governments in Wisconsin to incentivize or compel the conservation of places in their communities that hold historic or cultural value. I suspect there'll be a lot of questions tonight, so I'm going to try to keep this presentation short. I'm going to try to move through it quickly so we have plenty of time to ask questions and clarify things at the end. I want to spend a little time teeing up the conversation, though, because I think it's important to understand that historic preservation policy in this country has a deep background and has evolved pretty significantly over the last 170 years and has evolved along two different paths. So I want to take I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly. I want to take a broad look at historic preservation and think about why we conserve historic places and a couple of points about the language, about that language. I like to sometimes use the word conserve when thinking about historic properties because conserve implies that properties are subject to change over time as usage of spaces changes. Preservation policies are typically designed to conserve historic buildings or manage the changes necessary in order to avoid unnecessary loss of character-defining design and features. The term preservation and preserve sometimes has connotations of freezing a property in place like a museum piece, and that's actually not the goal of historic preservation policies. And if that is your goal, you're doing it wrong. So the term places, the word places, mostly we think about historic preservation. We think about buildings, but there are a lot of other places in our communities that hold cultural and historic value. Think about parks and cemeteries, effigy mounds, designed landscapes or landscapes that were important, where important events happened and that can hold important associations for a community's history. So I just wanted to make sure that we keep those types of places in mind when we talk about preservation policies. So why do we try to conserve historic places? We all tend to have personal reasons for historic preservation, nostalgia. Old buildings hold personal memories of a place. Artistic value, old buildings are beautiful and irreplaceable architecture. National history, a society's identity and history is often validated by the places that we can visit and walk through and experience. Travel, people like to visit historic places and places that define a community or a culture or a nation. There are academic reasons. Our architecture history is part of it's a component of human history. It's a uniquely human combination of art and practicality. Architecture is material culture that conveys a community's history. So on a policy level, for local governments, the question gets a little more nuanced and becomes, why do we try to influence the conservation of historic properties? And as a municipality, it helps to think about historic places as cultural resources resources in a community that carry that community's identity and that community's history. It's also useful to consider that public policy takes a long view, often 20, 50, 100 years into the future, and buildings may go through 10 or 15 phases of ownership in those time periods. So any one owner of a building is the steward of that building for the time that they own it, but the building continues to contribute to the landscape and the city's identity for the entire life of that building. In most cases, that can be a century or more. So why do communities place historic value on historic places in architecture? Generally, they help cultivate a sense of place and identity for a community. That they set this place apart from any place. A Walgreens or a Starbucks or a Amazon distribution center contribute to the local economy, but they don't distinguish your community from any other community. The places that are unique to your community do that. There are other specific reasons that some cities have implemented historic preservation policies. Economic reasons. New young businesses tend to prefer adaptive reuse of older buildings. They like the unique character. They tend to be less expensive than new construction. Environmental reasons. Existing buildings are adaptable. They're reusable. They don't require the consumption of resources to demolish and rebuild new buildings. And there have been dozens of studies and books written on this issue. Tourism. Some cities have cultivated a significant tourism economy based on historic neighborhoods and architecture. Historic places are often the motivation for people visiting a place and sticking around to experience more of it. Affordability. Communities with old, deteriorated housing stock have opportunities. Housing and industrial buildings, commercial buildings, have an opportunity to combine historic tax credits with low-income housing tax credits to develop low-cost housing. Combining the low-cost loans through local government, you can cultivate a fertile environment for developing low-cost housing in historic industrial, commercial buildings, and even in neighborhoods of traditional single-family housing that have experienced neglect. So every community that considers how to treat their historic resources needs to have that conversation about your motives and your objectives. What are you trying to do with your policy? And the methods. How are we going to achieve what we want to do? So what I'm going to do is talk through the main tools on which local policies, local preservation policies are typically based. And I'm going to breeze through really quickly a history of federal historic preservation policies. Bear with me here for a few minutes. I think it's important to just to put these policies into context. This will go really quickly. I'm going to breeze through this really quick. So federal preservation legislation and milestones. Starting in 1816, the first federal law designed to preserve a historic property. This was a single piece of legislation written to protect a single property, arguably one of the most significant locations associated with the founding of this country, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were drafted, up to 1853 in the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, not necessarily a federal policy, but the first advocacy organization in the US organized to save and restore the home of George and Martha Washington. 1872, Yellowstone National Park was established to conserve natural resources, is what we think of mostly, but there's a lot of cultural resources associated with, with Yellowstone National Park and other national parks as well. Mostly archaeological sites associated with American Indian communities. 1889, the first federal appropriation of funding to preserve a cultural resource. Have you ever been to Casa Grande ruins in Arizona? That was the first expenditure of federal funds for a preservation project. 1906, the Antiquities Act implemented penalties for looting or damaging federally owned historic sites on federal property. 1916, the National Park Service is established. And again, national parks often, almost probably all national parks have cultural resources in them as well. 1933, the HABS program, the Historic American Buildings Survey, was established to document historic structures of all types nationwide. 1935, the Historic Sites Act is the first assertion by the US government that preservation of historic sites, buildings, and objects for public use is a federal policy. And finally, 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act. This is the first nationwide policy to incentivize the preservation of privately owned historic properties. And this is the predominant federal policy that we operate under today. So what I'm going to talk through now is how the National Historic Preservation Act works and how it benefits local governments and communities. So the National Historic Preservation Act established the National Register of Historic Places. You're all familiar with the National Register. It devised a set of universal standards for evaluating historic significance and designating those historic places on the National Register. So a set of standards that are universally applicable to different types of historic properties. It enabled financial incentives in the form of tax credits for preservation of private property, while not infringing on private property rights. It established a process for identifying historic properties affected by federal projects. When a federal agency is doing a project that involves federal funding, licensing, or permitting, this policy provides for the mitigation, for the identification of historic properties and mitigation of any adverse effects on those historic properties. And finally, the National Historic Preservation Act established my office, SHPOs, in each state, and THPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices in Native American tribal nations. So the National Register program is purely an incentive-based program. It's a carrot designed to encourage the owners of historic properties to conserve them rather than a stick that compels them with rules and penalties. If you take nothing away from tonight's session, remember that there are two very different programs: the federal program, the National Register program, and then there are local ordinances, local historic preservation ordinance. We'll talk through both and answer any questions you have about both of them. They do get confusing, but they are very, very different programs. And I'm going to talk through both of them. First, the federal policy that I've just mentioned, the National Register program. How does the program work? The National Register program is structurally really simple. It involves the nomination of properties to the National Register. The nomination is then reviewed by a state agency, a state board, and then the National Park Service. And the property is listed in the National Register, or it's not. It goes either way. And just want to flesh that out a little bit. So the nomination, anybody can nominate a property. It's a formal nomination process, and there's a formal nomination form that's required. It requires a lot of description, documentation, and a compelling argument that the property or district, can be an individual property or a district, meets the eligibility criteria. And you have to make that case very clearly. It has to meet one of 4 criteria. It only has to meet one, doesn't have to meet all 4. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the criteria in a minute. And it has to have integrity. It has to have as much of its original design and materials to kind of convey its historical associations. The review process is pretty rigorous. My office reviews all nominations pretty thoroughly, very thoroughly. A nomination is then reviewed at our state board, State Historic Preservation Review Board. If that board approves the nomination, then it's forwarded to the National Park Service and it's reviewed again. If the Park Service's review concludes that the nomination is sufficient, it meets the criteria, then it is listed in the National Register. Owner consent is required. The designers of the federal program were very deliberate in not wanting to infringe on private property rights. So even though the National Register program does not place any encumbrances on private property, the rules were designed so that owners of private property could decline designation under the National Register program. Even though it's all benefit, no stick, you can decline. You don't have to approve of or support the nomination of your property to the National Register. Historic districts, that consent is a little different. The National Park Service will not designate a district if more than 50% of the property owners oppose in writing the designation. So the benefits of the National Register program. There are some very clear benefits for property owners. First of all, it's honorary. It's kind of a mark of distinction to be listed in the National Register and to know that your property went through a rigorous review process and meets rigorous federal standards. Wider availability of grant funding. There are a lot of, shouldn't say a lot, there are funding opportunities that come along once in a while, and some from standing organizations in support of historic properties. And often those funding opportunities, one of the thresholds is that your property is listed in the National Register, or at least eligible for the National Register. So a wider availability of grant funding is a benefit. And finally, federal tax credits. Not finally, because there's state tax credits as well. But the federal tax credit program returns 20% of qualified expenses for commercial property. So any commercial property that includes commercial residential properties, so apartment buildings, income producing properties. I won't get too deeply into the tax credit program, but I will say that the program returns 20% of qualified expenses in the form of a federal income tax credit, a direct credit to your federal income taxes. So that projects like roofing, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, exterior painting and repairs are all eligible for the federal commercial tax credit program. There's also the Wisconsin tax credit program. Wisconsin has a great tax credit program for historic properties, one of the best in the country. For residential properties, it returns 25% of eligible expenses, those expenses that I just mentioned, in the form of a state direct credit to your state tax obligation, state income tax obligation. There is also a Wisconsin tax credit for commercial properties that returns 20% of eligible expenses. So for commercial properties, the financing is pretty lucrative. You can combine the state and federal tax credit programs for a total of 40% tax credit for qualified expenses on commercial properties. It's a really significant financing tool for commercial properties. So how do these work? Property owners plan a rehab. I'll just walk through this really quickly. Property owners plan a rehab project in a way that retains the historic design and materials as much as possible. So there are design standards that you have to meet in order to use the tax credit program. So they must meet these standards for conservation of the historic character and materials. And we have architects in our office who will work with homeowners and commercial property owners to understand those standards and to meet those standards, and to design your rehab to meet those standards so that you can get the tax credit. For homeowners projects, you have to spend a minimum of $10,000 and a maximum of $40,000. But you can combine smaller projects to get to $10,000. You can split larger projects to get under that $40,000 threshold, and submit as many tax credit applications as you need to cover all of your project expenses. You get plans approved by an architect in our office to make sure that they meet those standards. Once the work is approved, you do the work, you track your expenses, you get reviewed You get the work reviewed when it's completed. Once the work is completed, one of our architects, the same one that you've been working with, will review the work and approve or certify the work for tax credits. You submit that documentation with your federal and or state income tax returns and get approved for that direct credit to your tax obligation. I want to emphasize that there's no obligation to use this tax credit program. If you're listed in the National Register individually, or if you're in a historic district, you don't have to use this tax credit program. If you're interested in maintaining the character and materials of your property and you want to meet those standards, then you can use the tax credit program, but there's no obligation to use the program. And finally, encumbrances resulting from the National Register listing, there are none, zero. There's no adjustment to property assessment or your property tax. In fact, the Wisconsin state constitution does not allow unequal application of property taxation. So there's no impact on your assessment or your property tax. There's no impact on your property insurance because there is no obligation to use the tax credit program. There's no obligation to maintain the historic character. There's no obligation to repair damaged property with historically appropriate materials. Sometimes insurance companies misunderstand what historic designation means, and they'll try to tell you that your premiums will maybe increase if and when your property is designated to the National Register. It happens occasionally, but it's an utterly baseless justification for increasing your premiums. But it happens often enough that we actually have a memorandum that we will send to insurance companies to let them know that there is no requirement in a federally designated National Register historic district or property, no requirement to repair or rebuild with historically appropriate materials. And we do send that memo out occasionally when property owners ask us if it's justified that their premiums, their homeowners insurance policy or property insurance is going up because they're in a historic district. So let's talk a little bit about local historic preservation programs. That was the federal program, National Register program. Let's switch now to talking about local historic preservation programs. And again, I want to breeze through a little bit of the background so you have some context on local historic preservation programs. And this, again, I'll breeze through this pretty quickly just to give you a sense of where communities in the United States have been in terms of local policies. So the first ever local historic preservation policy was passed in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a pioneering local ordinance, not to mention historic preservation ordinance. And if you've been to Charleston, you've seen the strong identity that the city has as a coastal seaport and the distinctive architecture there that's adapted to its subtropical climate. The city's pioneering historic preservation ordinance took the form of a local zoning ordinance that prohibited development that would detract from the historical and architectural setting of the city's historic core. It applied to the historic core of the city, and it defined that area sort of like what we do today with historic districts, and it provided review and approval. It provided for local review and approval by the local government of exterior architectural features within that area under the city's zoning code. There was no legal precedent for this. There was no enabling legislation in the state for this. So it really was an innovative kind of pushing the boundaries ordinance at the time. And this was around the time when cities were experimenting with this new concept of a zoning code. And these local zoning laws were being upheld in courts as legal and necessary municipal powers to control land use. Jumping up to 1936, Louisiana is the first state that enabled cities to adopt zoning ordinances, and New Orleans was the first city with a preservation ordinance. They adopted a zoning ordinance and also included in that historic preservation ordinance as well. 1936, Alexandria, Virginia follows suit. 1938, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. 1939, so these are all the early kind of pioneering, innovative cities that are willing to kind of push the boundaries with this kind of zoning. San Antonio, Texas, and they did it specifically for this small area, it's a little arts district called La Villita. And then World War II happens, and after World War II, in the post-war years, we start to see cities pick up this idea again. Washington, D.C. Adopts a local ordinance for the Georgetown Historic District. And by 1963, you had 42 American cities with local ordinances. 1971, you have the first city in Wisconsin with a local ordinance, that was Madison. And then in 1978 is a key point in local historic preservation legislation. This is when the New York City Historic Preservation Ordinance was challenged to the US Supreme Court. And the court concluded in that case that they decided that the local regulation of historic character under the city's zoning powers did not constitute a taking and therefore does not violate the 5th or 14th Amendments. So these local ordinances were challenged to the Supreme Court in 1978, and after that you see kind of a flood of cities, American cities, adopting these local ordinances. 1981, Milwaukee adopts an ordinance. By 1990, we had hundreds of cities nationwide with local preservation ordinances. Today we have well over 2,300 cities nationwide that have local ordinances, and over 100 in Wisconsin. So how does a local ordinance work? Local historic preservation ordinances are typically embedded in a city's zoning code, or they're adjacent to the zoning code, and they work in tandem with a city's zoning code. The city creates a zoning overlay to identify historic properties designated under the process prescribed by the ordinance. And I'm going to get a little technical and complicated here, but we'll have some time at the end for questions and to clarify this. And also, as we continue the conversation, as Shorewood continues the conversation, the State Historic Preservation Office and I will certainly be on hand to help understand how this works and how to implement it if that's the direction that the village heads. So briefly, an ordinance is adopted that has some standard components. And the standard component of a local ordinance is that it creates criteria for designating properties as historic. And communities can define those criteria however they see fit and whatever works in that community. But typically they're based on architecture or historic associations. So associations with events or people that have some defining history in the city. It creates a commission, and the commission is an agency of the local government, sort of like a plan commission or a zoning commission, with the power to administer the ordinance, often with quasi-judicial powers to review and permit exterior alterations to properties. Not always, not all commissions are quasi-judicial. Some are advisory to a higher commission or a council or a board. The ordinance prescribes a transparent public process for nominating, designating historic properties. It often includes a nomination process, fair notification to the owner or owners, and opportunities for the public to comment on the proposed designation. Those nominations are reviewed by the commission and given final approval by the council or the board. The ordinance creates a new zoning designation for historic properties. It creates design standards for exterior alterations of those designated properties. The ordinance also requires review of proposed exterior work by the commission, and often empowers the commission to review and certify that those proposed exterior alterations meet the design standards. Most local ordinances have an appeals process, appeals provisions. They're typically built into local ordinances so that decisions of the commission may be appealed to a higher commission or a council or a board. Most local ordinances also have variances. Variances are very common, and they can be defined by the community according to what the community's goals and desires are for their ordinance. And they're defined when you make your ordinance. They can be added later as the ordinance evolves and develops, and you learn how it is used. There are a range of variances. Some of the common ones are economic hardship, existing economic hardship of the owner. Some have a variance for strong alternative design. And that language can be crafted in your ordinance as you see fit to allow a really strong design to replace something that is historic. Variance can be in the form of a balancing test. Madison has an interesting variance where their ordinance allows the commission to diverge from those design standards, quote, if the benefits to the general public substantially outweigh the strong public interest in preserving historic resources. So that's a pretty significant variance that balances the public benefits of a project against the public's interest in preserving the historic resource. So the point here is that local ordinances are products of the local community and the local government. They should meet the objectives of the community without more rules than the community will tolerate. And that's the tricky conversation that every community needs to have as they enter into this process. Important things to remember about local historic preservation ordinances is that they are driven and crafted by the local policy-making process and should be designed to meet the objectives that the majority of the residents in the community can support. Rationale for local ordinance should be clearly articulated by policymakers, and a thorough, transparent public engagement process should precede the adoption of a local ordinance. And that's kind of the principle behind this series of presentations. This series is intended to kind of start that conversation, lay out the groundwork for this conversation. So let's look at some of the implications of local ordinances. The most significant implication of local ordinances often is that it adds a new layer of zoning. It adds a new layer of zoning and a new set of rules for historically designated properties. The local government, through its representation, must decide which properties it wants to commit to and decide which are important enough to the identity of the community that they need to be protected through the city's zoning powers. But again, most communities build in pressure releases to their ordinance, appeals, and variances. The city has to commit staff time to the administration of the ordinance. Designated properties under the local ordinances are encumbered with additional standards for exterior alterations and additional review and permitting processes. So, so there is a bit of an encumbrance in that regard. Just a few other tools that some local governments use to incentivize the conservation of historic property. So those were the main two, the federal program and a local zoning ordinance. There are some other tools that I'll go over briefly that some communities use to benefit historic properties. And these are typically tied to that historic designation once a community has an ordinance that allows them to designate historic properties. These are kind of additional tools that a city can use once they have that tool to designate. A lot of communities implement grant programs. You may have heard of facade improvement grant programs. I'm not sure if Shorewood has one, but a lot of communities have a facade improvement grant program. And it's often tied to these design standards in the local ordinance. So if you have a historic, it doesn't, often they don't even have to be designated historic commercial buildings. The city of Madison, and I think Madison I'm most familiar with, but the city of Madison uses their facade improvement grant program for commercial buildings that are not even in historic districts or have a historic designation. But a city can tie those grants to the design standards for historic buildings so that you can get a grant to rehab the facade of your commercial building if you get approved under these design standards. If you follow the design standards for historic buildings, we'll grant you funding to do the rehab of your facade. Those can be applied to buildings with one facade or corner buildings with two facades. And of course, your community needs to decide if you're going to fund a grant program, how you fund it. So there's that conversation as well. A lot of communities offer low-cost loans, usually targeted to residences. So grants for commercial buildings, low-cost loans through city governments is a common tool. And again, you can tie those to the design standards for historic buildings. And cities can often offer favorable financing and repayment terms if they're arranged through the city. Some cities make these loans repayable only when the property is sold. So that's an interesting deferment of that payment. And that's a really attractive feature. Small cap TIF, I'm not going to say a lot about this because it's really complicated, and I am not super well versed in how small cap TIF works, but it's TIF loans that are directed toward usually residences that have been neglected or have been chopped up into smaller apartments, and they want to be converted. You want to encourage the conversion of them back to owner-occupied homes. They're often used. Sorry, I won't get into too deeply to small cap TIF, but it is a tool that's available if your circumstances, if it makes sense in your community's circumstances. Property tax abatement and special property valuation are often considered as a benefit for historic designation. We cannot do that in Wisconsin. Many states allow that. Wisconsin's, I mentioned earlier, the state constitution does not allow unequal application of property taxation. So this is not something that that cities in Wisconsin can use. Briefly want to go over the certified local government program. And we're coming up on 7 o'clock, so I'm going to rush through this too, and we're almost finished, and we can get to some clarifying questions and Q&A time. So the Wisconsin Certified Local Government Program. This is a program that's defined by the National Park Service. It's a program that I run in my office. It's a program that distributes federal funding from a fund called the Historic Preservation Fund that the National Park Service distributes every year. Our office gives away about $120,000 a year for historic preservation planning. So planning includes things like, so you can use this funding for things like surveys of historic properties. Shorewood has a recent survey, but that kind of survey is something that this program funds. You can use grant funding for nominations of properties and historic districts to the National Register. You can use it to develop design guidelines for your community, archaeological surveys, even educational programs. But in order to use the program, your community has to be a certified local government. And that's a process, that certification process is something that you would work with me on. And basically, to be certified, your community has to have a historic preservation ordinance, like we were just talking about, a commission to administer that ordinance. And your ordinance there's a few things that your ordinance has to have. And if Shorewood wants to go that direction, we can have that conversation. But you have to have an ordinance and a commission and basically a commitment from the local government to enforce that ordinance and enforce any state level historic preservation laws that apply. So I hope I clarify the difference between the two major programs, the federal incentive-based program and local zoning-based programs. And as you think about this as a community, remember that it's important to articulate your motivation for whatever program you're thinking about using, and your objectives for implementing a historic preservation program. It's important to have a broad conversation, and this is the start of that conversation. This series is really, hopefully will kickstart the conversation in Shorewood as you think about one or both of these programs to use in Shorewood. It's important for leaders and planning staff to understand the tools and how they can be used and how they might work in your community in your particular set of circumstances. And my office is always available to advise local governments on historic preservation policy. We have expertise in our office on local policies, state policies, federal rules for municipal governments. And we're here for the benefit of local governments as you continue in these conversations. So we are about 5 minutes to 7. So I want to devote the rest of our time to clarifying anything that I've said here, filling in any gaps, and answering questions that y'all might have on these programs. So we've got 36 minutes left for Q&A. So I think we're using the Q&A box for questions, and anything that I've covered tonight, any questions, concerns that you might have on any of these programs, how they might work in Shorewood, now's the time to ask, now's the time to talk about them. I dumped a lot of information.
So the first question is, at the moment, Shorewood does not have any of these designations.
Any of these designations?
I suppose any of these. So I guess either National Register or local ordinance.
Sherwood has, I think last time I said that Sherwood has 8 individual properties listed on the National Register. So those are eligible for the state and federal programs if it's a commercial property. But I also determined that, I mentioned in the last session, that Shorewood has about 1,100 properties that would be eligible for the National Register and thus eligible for the tax credit program. Shorewood does have a local ordinance, as I understand, and I've looked at it, and it has kind of a fatal flaw in it. It's one of those ordinances that was adopted in 1995 when the state said any municipality in Wisconsin that has a National Register listed building has to have a basic ordinance. And so in 95 and 96, you had all these communities that were adopting ordinances based on a model ordinance that my office was distributing at the time. I don't know where you are as far as enforcing that ordinance, but I did look at it, and it's got a flaw in it that should be looked at and maybe amended. And I can work with you on that.
So I think
Could
that.
you speak just a little bit about historic districts?
I'm sorry, Karen, what was that?
Yeah, could you speak just a little bit about historic districts? Because that's as to what they are and what's included and
Sure.
just the difference between that and an individual building.
Sure. A historic district is an area of a community or a collection of properties that are associated somehow. So I think the example I gave last time was the community of Kohler. which was built by the Kohler Company as a community for their employees. So that community, that little community of Kohler, is all associated with the Kohler Company. So that may be eligible as a historic district, and it may be listed, I'm not sure. Another example would be a school complex, a public school complex that has 4 or 5 different buildings could be a historic district because they're all associated with the same aspect of history. The 2011 survey of Shorewood identified, I think, 8 historic districts. Those are all unified by their architecture. So they have, those districts have a strong representation of the architectural styles that were popular in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s when Shorewood was being built up really quickly. And so those are all associated with by their architecture. So a historic district can be nominated as a district. Every property that contributes to that district would be then eligible for the tax credit program. And most often in historic districts, most of the properties in the district are considered contributing to the district, and there's often a small collection of outliers that don't contribute. Those are not eligible for tax credits, but every contributing property in the district is eligible.
Okay, so I think there was a question, maybe this is the bigger question. What is Shorewood considering doing? And would that be updating the ordinance? I think what's on the table here is the question.
Yeah, I think that's more of a question for Rebecca. What we're doing here, what Rebecca and I and Kathy and Karen have done here is to kind of outline all of the options that Shorewood has, that other communities have used as precedent for decades. And it sounds like Shorewood is getting to a point where they want to have that conversation about what does fit our community and what would work well in our community and what would our residents welcome and tolerate.
And I can chime in there a little bit, Jason. There is nothing being proposed at this point in time. And that's primarily for the reason that we first want to learn about the tools. When I started out the presentation, I was clear from the perspective that there's a lot of misinformation about how different tools may or may not impact different properties. And so first, we really wanted to have a conversation and an educational opportunity to learn about what could be available to Shorewood. And then have some thoughtful conversation and hear from the community in terms of how they desire to proceed. We had a property, now I want to say in 2019 or 2020, that was taken down on Lake Drive that sparked a lot of community conversation. It was a private residence, and what was evident to me, because I handled most of the public relations on the property from a news perspective, was that for every phone call I received from someone wanting to save the structure, I equally received a phone call from a resident stating, please don't provide for additional regulation on housing here in the village. So listening hard to both of those types of comments, it became clear that I needed to get more education. The board needed to get some more education in terms of what options were there. And I know that working with the Shorewood Historical Society, there have been different concepts explored that perhaps wouldn't have a significant amount of regulation. And does the community desire to explore those avenues? So once we conclude this series, we're going to be launching a community-wide survey for people to provide input in terms of what avenues they desire to explore.
So sort of as a follow-up to that, there's a question, what are the current Shorewood rules regarding historic preservation and changes to residential properties?
And Amy, I will put this into, should I put it into the Q&A? I will copy the link to our ordinance, which talks about historic structures. I don't want to belabor the conversation by reading through it because it may be boring if I read it for people, but I'm going to cut and paste it into there so that people can have that link and click on it and take a look.
Sure, yeah, if you can put that into the chat, they should be able to click on that. Go ahead.
There's a couple of questions about historic districts that maybe we can jump to. Sarah Schneider asked, are there already some proposed historic districts in Shorewood? Where are they, and how many houses would be in them? I talked about this in session 2, but to recap, the survey in 2011 identified 8 historic districts in Shorewood that would be potentially eligible for the National Register. It included about 1,100 individual properties. And then to another question, somebody says, I'm still unclear as to what designation as a historic district would mean. Kind of piggybacking on the previous question, it depends on whether or not you're talking about a federally designated National Register historic district or a historic district designated under a local ordinance. The 8 historic districts that were identified in the 2011 survey were evaluated under the National Register criteria. So they would be eligible, very likely if they were nominated, they would be eligible for the National Register program. That would mean no encumbrance whatsoever. It would mean the availability of, for residential properties, the availability of the state 25% tax credit. For commercial properties, and there are a few districts that include commercial properties in Shorewood, those properties would be eligible for the 20% state credit and the 20% federal credit. So if I were advising a city like Shorewood, the slam dunk would be get those districts designated, and you would have access, all those properties would have access to federal, state or federal tax credit program. There's no encumbrance on those properties. 1,100 properties with access to tax credits is a pretty significant economic development tool.
So we've had a couple of questions. I think this is a good time for it. What are some examples of projects that qualify for state or federal tax credits?
Examples of projects?
The type of work that's eligible for the tax credits.
So when you're talking about residential properties, houses, roofing is eligible for credits, plumbing, everything but fixtures. So all the plumbing in your basement and in your walls up to the 2nd floor, 3rd floor, all the plumbing repair replacement is eligible. Electrical work is eligible. Electrical upgrades, running new electrical lines. HVAC, heating, ventilating, air conditioning is all eligible. Repair of exterior materials. And this is where the standards get kind of tricky. If you want to, if you have a brick house and you need some tuck pointing or a repointing of the brick, that is eligible for tax credits. If you want to take off the original or the deteriorating original exterior siding of the house, that's gonna get tricky, and it would not likely meet the standards. The standards are gonna say you need to repair the siding that's deteriorated and retain the original siding that's still in good condition. So you can repair deteriorated siding, replace it in kind, replace it with the same or similar material. But replacing siding or windows wholesale, that's where it gets kind of tricky. That's where the standards say repair up to a point where it's unrepairable, and then you can replace. So all of those types of projects would be eligible for the tax credit program.
Let's see, I think you touched on this a little bit, Rebecca. So what are the next steps in planning to engage a larger number of residents on this issue? And what next steps are planned by Shorewood in the timeline?
Our next process will be to republicize the recorded series of these sessions that we've taken the time to provide to the community over the last 3 weeks. We will also be launching a community-wide survey that will be distributed in conjunction with the summer issue for Shorewood Today, so that we can be assured that we're reaching everyone possible here in the village who may have a desire to weigh in and how we should proceed. We're going to be collecting those responses throughout the summer and then providing back a report on those results to the board in fall, and then reviewing some options and seeking their direction in how to proceed.
So I think there are a few questions that I think would probably be addressed during that process. For instance, if Shorewood adopts a historic preservation ordinance, can it designate homes without the owner's consent?
I'm sorry, can you, my connection was breaking up a little bit.
Oh, so I think this is a question as you're working on the ordinance and thinking about the future. If Shorewood adopts a historic preservation ordinance, can it designate homes without the owner's consent?
It depends on how you write your ordinance. You don't have to write your ordinance to so that your ordinance does not have to be able to. It doesn't have to allow owners to opt out. It doesn't have to include an opt-out clause. It can. For the CLG program to be certified as a local government, to have access to that grant funding, your local ordinance does need to be able to designate over the objections of an owner. So for the CLG program, your ordinance does have to have that provision to be able to allow the city to designate over the objections of an owner. So the 73 CLGs in Wisconsin do have that in their ordinance. That doesn't mean that the community or that the local government has to do it. It's kind of a power reserved for communities that have that have something really special in their community, that the local government wants to use their local regulation power to compel the preservation of that property. And again, you don't have to use it. There are communities that have this in their ordinance and they've never used it, but the power is there. You're muted.
Sorry. I think this is a sort of a follow-up question because you spoke about the National Register nomination process. How does a local designation process typically work?
It's very similar to the National Register process. A local ordinance typically has criteria for eligibility, like, so what makes it historic? There's a nomination process, and typically a city will develop a simple nomination form so that somebody can nominate a property or a district under the local ordinance. It gets reviewed by the commission that is set up by the ordinance. That commission typically will recommend designation of that property or that district to the council or the board, and the final decision will rest with the council or the board to actually designate that property or the district. And that's the city committing to that property, committing their power of the power that of regulation in their ordinance to that property.
There have been a few questions about what this means for properties that are going to be torn down, and maybe addressing the difference between being listed on the National Register and what that means for a tear down versus maybe a local ordinance.
Yeah, and here is the very, very stark difference between the two programs. If you're listed on the National Register, you can demolish your property. Full stop. Period. You can demolish your property. You can do anything with your property if it's listed on the National Register. If it is listed, designated under a local ordinance, then you're limited by what that local ordinance allows. And like I said, all local ordinances are a little bit different. Some of them allow demolition under certain circumstances. Typically, the standards would need to be varied. You'd need to get a variance to demolish a historic property. But again, it depends on how your local ordinance is written. Typically, local ordinances make it kind of difficult to full-on demolish a historic property because that would clearly be in violation of the design standards that are intended to conserve the character of historic properties.
And there have been a couple of questions about, I guess, owner permission. And maybe if you could talk about the difference between maybe owner permission and an objection in a National Register district versus a local district.
Permission, are you talking about designation?
Yes, to be listed.
So for a National Register district, the National Park Service has the final say over what gets designated. The National Park Service will not designate a individual property if the owner objects. So you can object to a National Register listing of your individual property and it will not be listed. In the case of a historic district, if more than 50% of the owners in that district submit their written opposition to the designation of that district, the Park Service will not list it. So it has to be over 50%. If you're right at 50%, they'll still get listed. You have to have one more than 50%. And so for local designation, here again, it depends on how your local ordinance is written. If you're, there are local ordinances in Wisconsin that allow owners to essentially veto their designation under the local ordinance. There are at least 73 ordinances in Wisconsin, and probably more, that allow that do not allow the owner of a property to veto a designation. So ordinances that allow the city to designate a property over the objection of the owner. Those are local ordinances again.
How long does the process take to become a federal or local historic district or property?
It kind of depends on the workload in our office. We have one person in our office who handles all of the National Register nominations in the state. If there's a heavy flow of nominations coming in, it can take longer. Typically, it will take about a year. And Amy, correct me if I'm wrong. You've been in the office longer than I.
I think I've generally seen 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
To work through the process.
Expect a year after a nomination is submitted till the time it's actually designated by the Park Service. And that's all review process, and it's mostly review at the state level and the federal level.
Are there advantages to obtain an individual designation versus a district designation? I think that might come down to maybe many properties wouldn't be eligible individually. They're only eligible as part of a district.
Right.
That's maybe the more of the issue there.
If you're the owner of an individual property, there's not really a benefit. There's not really any additional benefit to be individually designated. But if you're in a district that's eligible and your property is not individually eligible, you would benefit from being in a designated district. So all of the buildings in a district then have access to the tax credit programs, where individually they may not be eligible for listing.
So this might be a good quick follow-up. What are the criteria to be eligible for the National Register?
Okay. There, as I mentioned, there are 4 criteria. Any any individual property or district needs to meet one of them. They can meet 2 or 3, but they only need to meet 1 to be eligible. And those criteria are history, any association with events of history, so the founding of a village, or a big fire or earthquake that destroyed a village, and maybe this was the first building that was built after the fire. But any association with a significant events or trends of history in a community or a state or the nation. The second one is association with a significant person. So the leader of a community who led the community through a really prosperous period of development, or made a policy change that changed the direction of the community. So association with a really important person in the community. The third criteria is architecture. To be eligible for architecture, your building has to be an outstanding example of a particular architectural style. It has to be a representative example of the work of a master architect. So a Frank Lloyd Wright or a Alexander Eschweiler, a really good example of their work would be eligible for that criteria. And that's when you can also get districts like the ones that are eligible in Shorewood, where you have 3 decades, representative of 3 decades of popular architectural styles all in one area. And the fourth criteria is the potential for research potential. That criteria is typically used for archaeological sites that have some potential for to inform the history of the community that lived there. So it has to have some unexcavated component that has the potential to reveal strong information about that community. That criteria is also used for shipwrecks. Shipwrecks are typically designated under that criteria for research potential.
Another National Register question: can a home status be revoked if there are changes made that do not conform to the style or original integrity of the house, and how would that be assessed?
Yes, is the short answer. The long answer is a building is listed because it has integrity, because it shows its original design and materials from its historic period. If the owner completely altered the exterior, took off all the original siding, added another floor to the top of it, and just completely changed the building, it could be delisted. Properties are typically not actively delisted. There are a lot of properties out there that are technically listed on the National Register today, that are dramatically changed from their historic period. They're still technically listed in the National Register because there's no National Register police that go around and double check all of these listed buildings. If somebody points out that this property has been dramatically changed or is no longer there, it no longer exists, that can initiate the process of delisting, but it doesn't happen automatically.
Here's a good question that comes up often. If a district is listed in the National Register, will a local ordinance usually follow? And will we be opening a door that can make it harder for homeowners?
No, local ordinances do not necessarily follow National Register. There are many communities that use the National Register program a lot. They designate their districts, they designate their individual properties, and use those historic tax credit programs, and don't have a local ordinance at all. So they're not implemented in tandem. One doesn't necessitate the other.
Another question, which I think is a common misconception: if tax credits reduce taxes, will there be less money available for schools in the village? And I think that's a local tax versus a state tax issue.
Yes. So the tax credit program is a state program. And I'm not a tax expert by any means, but the state program returns income tax to property owners. Same with the federal program, it returns income tax to property owners. So whatever income taxes are used at the state level, I don't really know. Yes, it would draw down that pool of state income tax. And same with the federal level.
But it does not, the tax credit does not have anything to do with your local taxes or your property taxes.
Right, yes, thank you, Amy.
Let's see, lots of great questions. I don't know if we want to get into the polls too. It's 7:23, so.
Yeah, we've got some great poll questions for after this, all of this information.
So is there a quick summary of what the current ordinance is and what it entails?
I'm not sure that I can do that accurately. Maybe you can, Rebecca.
So I provided, I don't know if people can see in the chat function, but there is a link that goes directly to the code. And for those items, I'm just pulling it up so I can reference that. For a historic property based upon the ordinance is any building that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or the State Register of Historic Places as maintained by the State Historical Society of Wisconsin and located within the village. Those structures may not be modified unless a building permit is obtained and reviewed. That's the short summary.
Jason, do you have anything you'd want to talk about a conservation easement and how that might be different from a preservation ordinance?
I'm not an expert in conservation easements, but I can give you the basics of what easements do. And so if you own a property that has historic significance, it doesn't have to be listed, it doesn't have to be designated under any program, but if you want to make sure that your property retains its historic character after you sell it, you can put essentially a deed restriction on that property. It's a historic preservation easement, and it's attached to the property deed, and it requires future owners, future purchasers of that property to retain certain aspects of its historic character. And I can give you an example. There's a theater here in Madison that, well, there's a lot of examples that the state does. Well, I'll just give you the example of the theater. There's a theater here in Madison on State Street that was considering, and I don't know if they ever did this, but they were considering putting historic easement on their lighted sign. They have a big, beautiful lighted sign that says, what is it, Amy?
I should know.
It's one of those 1920s, palace theaters with the big lighted neon sign that goes up the marquee. And they wanted to make sure that that sign was preserved after they sold the property. So they put a historic easement, or they considered, I don't know if they ever did, but they considered putting a historic preservation easement on that sign so that anybody who bought the property in the future could do anything else they wanted with the property, but they had to maintain that historic sign. So that's an example of how preservation easements work. They can be applied to the whole property. The state actually holds, our office holds easements on properties that were owned by municipalities, but the municipalities sold them. They were listed on the National Register, and so sometimes we require that municipality to place preservation easement on that property when they sell it. So there are preservation easements all over the state. It's not the same as a property being designated under a local ordinance or the federal program, but it's a way to ensure that a building is preserved after you sell it. There's also a tax, and here again I'm getting outside of my wheelhouse, but if you have a preservation easement, there's a tax benefit to that. And I can't tell you exactly how that works, but there's a property tax benefit a reduction somehow, or a credit if you have a preservation easement on the property.
Sorry, I was just typing an answer in the Q&A there.
There's a couple of questions that I'm seeing, Amy. Can I jump in? How long do local ordinances stay in effect? As long as the local government keeps them in effect. It's just like any other ordinance. Once an ordinance is adopted, it's in effect. It requires the local government to repeal that ordinance in order for the effect in order for it to no longer be in effect. And so as long as that ordinance is in place and as long as that designation is in place, then the requirements of the historic district are in place. This is an interesting question. Do most communities which adopt an ordinance and create districts find it successful? Depends on what you mean by successful. But a lot of communities that I talk with, and I talk with communities all over the state who have preservation ordinances, a lot of them say that they appreciate that they have the protections in those districts. Very often they're commercial districts. A lot of communities will use historic preservation ordinances just in their commercial downtown district, so that the city has some zoning power to kind of maintain the historic character of their late 19th, early 20th century downtown historic core. And most cities that do that are really happy with how that works out. Most of the time, those local ordinances are flexible enough to allow new uses to come into those buildings, but effective enough to also compel the maintenance of historic character. And a lot of times owners of commercial properties in these districts will say they appreciate the guidance that they get from the local government and from our office. And a lot of times local governments will use a grant to develop design guidelines for those districts. Stoughton is doing this now, the city of Stoughton. They have a downtown historic district. Everybody loves it. It keeps the downtown really vibrant. And they have design guidelines for those commercial buildings. The ones that they have are very old. They were done in the early 90s. And so they just got a grant this year to update those design guidelines. And those are used by the owners of those commercial properties to know, to kind of as a guide to how to maintain and repair those historic commercial buildings. And they really appreciate that guidance.
So should we do our rapid fire polls here very quickly since it's 7:30?
I think that'd be great. I think we've covered some good territory. So perhaps the people who are on the session now will have some good reaction. Let's pull up the first one. Should the village pursue National Register listing tax credits for eligible commercial properties?
And commercial properties does include apartment buildings. So read commercial as income producing.
Okay, we'll give everybody another couple of seconds. Still a few people who might want to give an answer. I don't think anybody's being held to an answer tonight, so just your opinion based on tonight's presentation.
Very preliminary. This is just the start of the conversation.
So that's 74% yes and 26% need more information. So I'll bring up our next poll.
The same question, but relative to residential properties. Should the village pursue National Register listing or tax credits for eligible residential properties and districts?
I can tell a quick anecdote about this while we're waiting. The village, is it a village or a city of Whitefish Bay, just north of you, is wrestling with the same issue. Should we designate historic districts? And what we're seeing in Whitefish Bay are a lot of homeowners who want to use the tax credit program, but because their historic districts are not designated as districts, they're not all eligible to use the tax credit program. A lot of them want to, but their districts are not designated. And so they're getting to our office with applications, and we have to tell them no, because your district is not designated and your house is not individually eligible.
Okay, final couple of seconds to get your vote in. I think we'll cut it off there. So that's 82% yes, 4% no, and 14% need more information. Okay, next question.
Sorry, I was on mute. Should the village adopt rules for maintaining the exterior of historic character of historic commercial buildings only? And this, again, to Jason's point, would include apartment buildings. So should the village adopt rules for maintaining the exterior historic character of historic commercial buildings only? And that would include apartment buildings.
Give everyone a couple more seconds here. If anyone else would like to vote? Okay, that's 51% yes, 18% no, and 31% would like more information. So question number 6.
Number 6, should the village adopt rules for maintaining the exterior historic character of all historic properties? That would include residential, commercial, private, and public.
Give you one more second to decide. Most people have voted now. So that is 53% yes, 20% no, and 27% need more information. Okay, we have just 3 more questions.
Number 7. How would you characterize your feelings about historic preservation in general?
Okay, last call here. Any final answers? So that is 30% modernize and reuse as long as viable, and 70% should definitely be preserved. Next to last question.
What should the village do to conserve historic places in Shorewood?
This one might be hard to choose one answer over the others.
Yeah, unfortunately, you can't choose more than one. So I would say go with your most favored option.
You feel most strongly about.
That's one of my complaints with Zoom. You can only choose one poll answer. Okay, a few more seconds here. Chance to get your opinion in. So lots of support for different things that could be done, and no one said nothing. So last question.
Should the village take next steps towards considering local requirements for external alterations for historic buildings?
And this question is asking about a local ordinance, just to be clear. Not a national register. Designations.
Let's do about 5 more seconds on this one. Okay, so that's 73% yes, 10% no, and 17% need more information. And I believe that's the last question.
A lot of people clicking on need more information, Rebecca. So, and like we've said, this is just the beginning of the conversation. The community is going to be thinking about this more, and the community leadership. And I just want to say that my office is always here for advice and models and examples as you get into this conversation.
And I greatly appreciate that, Jason. You've been such just wonderful to work with, and to know that we have those resources at the state to help us through those next portions and discussions. I'm very grateful. Also wanted to extend a big thank you to the Shorewood Historical Society tonight, who has also been a wonderful partner. They are located within the Village Hall, so I get to see them from time to time, and have just been a wonderful resource for our entire community. They have really given Shorewood a gift in terms of what they do to help provide historic information to everybody who's here. So feel free to reach out to them as well. And last, I just want to express my gratitude to the Village Board for making this a priority to start listening to the options to continue the conversation. Again, as I said at the beginning, there's been no specific proposals. We are at the start of learning about different options that are available, and look forward to speaking with you more about this topic as we move throughout the year.
And as a member of the Shorewood Historical Society Board, as well as a resident of Shorewood for many years, I've welcomed this conversation too, because I have been aware of the resources the village has, and we need to keep having the conversation, because sometimes we don't know what we have here. And we all need to upgrade and change our village as the 21st century unfolds. But to have this open conversation and to have so many people willing to listen and talk. We talk, we learn. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate that. Thanks for the Wisconsin Historical Society, which is part of our
Oh no, we've lost you, Kathy.
and we're going to use them. Thanks for hosting.
Okay, well, if everybody's finished, I think we'll sign off now.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Well, thanks. Have a good evening.